So welcome tonight. Tonight we're going to look at self in Ruby. And yeah, we'll see where it takes us. I have some things I want to talk about, but if you have any questions, anything that you want to look at, anything where I'm talking or writing some code and you think, well, what's self when something? Just, shout it out or throw it in the chat and we can take a look at it. And yeah, I want to really just kind of go wherever this leads us, because I have some things, but you're probably wondering, and you probably have some questions as we're talking and as we're going through this that will pop up. So please shout them out through audio or in the chat, and that would be super helpful. So we can look at some unique things that I probably haven't thought of. So, yeah. So, to start off, what is self? So, in Ruby, there is always one object that plays the role of the current object at any given moment, given instant. And the current object provides an execution context, for the code. So, the current object is the default receiver, meaning when the receiver isn't provided, the message is sent to the default receiver. And this is the self. This is where things go. So we could say a current object, also known as the default receiver, is self. So let's see what self is at the top level. So let's just put self and see what happens. This is a Ruby file. There's nothing else here. I just put require pry up here so we can drop into it if we choose to. This is in a folder that has nothing else in it. Just this file self. So yeah, let's see what we get. Main. So this is telling us that Ruby has created an object called main for us at the top level, and all the code we write at the top level will use main as the receiver in method calls. So we have this top level self where we have main. So I'm just gonna write main there so that we have that reference. I don't think you have to worry about main too much, but it's just nice to know that there is something there when it appears that we have nothing there. This is, let's say, self at the top level. So we know that everything in Ruby is an object, is a pure object-oriented language. So with that, this main must be an object too. Now, if it's an object, then it must be an instance of a class. So let's see what we get if we call self.class. Or does anybody have a guess? I'll wait a second and see if you can think. Or maybe you know. Okay. Object. So if this prints object, then Ruby must be doing something for us with this main that it's creating, because main isn't there. Ruby is creating it for us, but it's not just, main has to be something, and now we know it's an object. So this tells us, so let's keep track of these. It's main, returns main, which is self at the top level. And then put self class. It's going to return to us object. What this tells us is that Ruby is doing something like this to create that main object. And what this does is it provides us with an object context to execute our code at the top level. So like we said before, everything is an object. So Ruby's creating an object that we can execute our code against at the top level. So it's providing us this default receiver main, and main is an instance of the object class. Making sense so far? Any questions? Okay, silence, deafening silence. Cool. So far, so good. Sounds good. So let's do a pretty standard thing. Let's print hello to our standard output. So put hello. And I think as expected, we should see hello. Hello. Okay. So we have our object main, and then we have our top level, which is saying hello. So we have our main object and our top level. Hello being a string is not an object or main. Correct. So like if we do we can't call puts on main. So if we did something like main.puts.hello, we're going to get this undefined local variable or method main for main object. So Ruby is going to print main as the current object at the top level, but there is no such variable called main that we can work with. So the main that we see, quote unquote, we should be able to get to our pry here. Okay. It needed somewhere to go. So, as we said before, we have our self, which is main. So, I guess I could just drop into IRB too, but self that, let's say, so main is the, like I said, human visible representation of the current object. And we haven't declared an object, so it's just this object that, you know, we have here. So if we do something like self dot inspect, it's telling us main. If we do self string, it's telling us main. But really, it's just a representation of that object, because self is always going to be something, and Ruby decided a long time ago that that main object is what it's going to call it and what it's going to create it. And the reason that Ruby creates the main object at the top level is in object-oriented languages like Ruby, there is always a sender and a receiver involved. And we did not explicitly create a sender object. Thus, Ruby created this object for us. And it is implicit because it's not visible in our code. So it's just one of those things that Ruby's doing for us because it's an object-oriented language. So let's look at some other examples of self. I think, you know, knowing that there's this main object created is cool, but it might just cause more confusion than always be helpful. But just to illustrate that there is this object that Ruby creates for us because it is an object-oriented language, and a pure object-oriented language where everything is an object, so it creates the object implicitly for us, even when we don't have one. So let's look at some more examples. I do want to see IRB self main. Cool. Okay. So let's look at what self is inside of an instance method. So let's create a class of dog. And create an instance method. And let's return self. And then let's create a dog. And let's say t dot bark is equivalent to D. So let's see what. So what do you think this is going to return? Okay, so it's self. That's one answer. Dog is another answer. That's cool, Aaron. If yeah, we're past where you are, but yeah, just listen along and keep throwing guesses out there. I think you're thinking thinking along the right tracks. So I think you both were kind of thinking the right way, but I need to return this. Let's just put a pry here and do this. Let's say d equals dog.new. So we have our dog, d.bark equals d. So that returns true. And I think you were thinking the right thing when you said dog, but weren't thinking about the equivalency that we were doing on line 24. So in this instance, what's happening is d.bark is self, or it's returning self. And in this context, self is going to be the current object. And the current object inside this instance method is this dog object, because bark is contained inside of this dog object. So when we get bark, or when we get self back, it's equivalent to the dog object that we created. So bark is an instance method, and it belongs to the object we created with dog.new. So self points to that object, because bark isn't an object, it's just a method. And stop me if you're lost or need anything clarified, just let me know. Okay. So I'll actually leave this. No, I'll leave it there for now. So that was self inside of an instance method. Now let's take a look at self inside of a class method. So let's make this a class level method by calling it self.bark. And let's just keep our pry here for now. Since this is a class level method, I'm going to dog.bark is equivalent to dog. So what do you think we're going to get? So we get true. Self was a good thought, but we're getting true here. Remember to look at the equivalency. So whenever you see a comparison operator, the two equals, we're always going to return true or false. So if we have greater than, less than, greater than, or equal to, or this equals to. So in this example, bark is a class level method of dog. And with class methods, the class itself, quote unquote, owns the method. So since the class owns the method, not the object created from that class, self points back to that class in this instance. And this would work the same for class methods inside of modules. So whenever you get modules, it would work exactly the same in that instance. So a key to remember is that classes and modules are treated as objects in Ruby. So ultimately, this behavior isn't that different from the instance method behavior that we saw in the first example. It's just looking at what object the method is attached to, and then pointing back to it. So ultimately, we're always just looking at the current object and keeping track of what object that is. So another thing that is useful to see is that in Ruby, I'll leave that one there. Class dog and actually not sure where this will return, but we'll see. So a feature of Ruby that makes it great for frameworks like Ruby on Rails, which we learn. There's some others out there built on Ruby, Rails being the leader by much, by lots, is that we can execute code inside class and module definitions. So Aaron's asking, basically, if you have multiple classes with multiple unique methods, it will point to the class depending on where the method is contained. Yes, if I'm reading that correctly. So self will always be pointing to its, I always like to think of it as pointing to its parent object. So I'm saying, okay, wherever this code is, there's an object. So where is the closest object from wherever self is written? And that's where I'm looking. And that's what always made sense in my mind. Now tracking that down can sometimes be tricky in your mind, because we have this class dog, and we can have Let's say A equals, oh, yeah, that was wrong. Dog.new, B equals dog.new, C equals dog.new. And those are all going to be dog objects. And if we don't have an instance method in this instance, in this case here, because we were just working with this class level method, but if we did, these three dog objects, depending on their own properties, could have different responses to self, because they could have, the way self is being used with them could produce different results. It would be referencing these objects individually, but they are all different. So I think sometimes thinking about that can get confusing in our minds and trying to keep track of it. So if we did a separate class of cat with a method of meow, self would then be the cat. So let's see if I can get what you're thinking of. So it'll depend on the method. So if we do an instance method, then this instance method is attached to the object cat. So every cat that's created will have its own self in that meow. Whereas if we have the class level method cat, then we're looking at the actual cat class with the meow method and not the cat objects that are created from it. Cool. Glad it makes sense. Yeah, it's there's no way around using the same word. So, you have a cat class and you have cat objects, and objects are created from the class. So there's a difference, but the word is the same. So let's go back to this and see. Oops. I guess I can put this. We'll be able to see the result. That'll be simple enough, I think. Sweet, returned. So here we see that self is pointing to the class or module that's even in the process of being defined. So technically this hasn't been defined yet until we get to the end of the code, but it still is pointing to it even before it's done executing. So when you put code inside of a class definition, it runs just like any other Ruby code, except the difference is the value of self, pretty much. Let's see. How you guys feeling about where we're at? Any other questions? The shortcut for commenting blocks of code. I've found that in most code editors, it is Control or Command forward slash. I always say my slash is wrong. Is that a forward slash? But yeah, it's definitely a useful one. It might be different depending on what you're using. But yeah, learning the keyboard shortcuts. I committed to trying to teach myself like one a day, and I think I've learned 5, so I haven't really been keeping up with that, but they're very useful when you actually know them. So we can look at some other examples. Don't think I want to go too far down the rabbit hole of self in some other contexts. And we can keep on looking at some of these just some more complex ones of these same types of examples. I just don't think that well, maybe it's useful. I don't know. This might be past most people, but and it's more advanced, but it is kind of cool. So let's look at it. So let's say I have a dog. I want to talk about how self is being used here. And this is going to be using it inside of, or self's use inside of the meta class. So let's say bark. Chew. Fetch. So let's separate this a little bit. So this is a neat little shortcut, and all of these methods are going to be class level methods. It's a cool little use of self. So our line 27 right here is some pretty cool syntax and interesting. So it's going to let us, I guess us, our code, what have you, access the object's meta class, which is also called the singleton class, if you see it called that somewhere else. And really just need to know that the meta class is where Ruby stores methods that are unique to a certain object. So when you access self from inside the class shovel self block, you get the meta class. So let's look at actually what's going on, what we get in here. Let's look at this. This will be interesting. So we're seeing that we're getting this string object inside of the class object. And that's because test is this string. And I think, let's see what happens with this one. So self is going to give us our dog class. And then it's defining these methods on that class. That's a cool little thing that you can do when you're looking at having a set of a bunch of class level methods. It's definitely a more advanced thought process, and like just something I ran across when looking at some stuff for this lecture. But it's cool to see that, you know, self is all around and you can do some cool things with it. So we looked at instance methods, we looked at class methods, we looked at the meta class, we looked at the top level self with main. Yeah, I think that's the extent. Well, I guess I don't think, I know that's the extent of the notes that I had for this evening and things that I wanted to present on self. Still got almost 20 minutes left in the lecture time. So any questions about self, anything that you want to look at, say, hey, you want to, what happens if we put self here? What self of this we can look at? Just let me know. If you have none of that and you are just content and ready to run to write more code, that's cool too. I do need to throw a link into the chat for our survey that we're doing with study groups now. It's I think it's 7 questions. It's real quick, multiple choice. I think there might be 1 or 2 lines where you can type in. One being like, who was the leader of your study group? And that's me, Seth. But really, it's all about helping us to create the best content possible and study groups that are the most beneficial for you guys and gals. So it's really just to provide feedback to help us get better and do this as best as possible. And we know that the best way is to find out what the students think. So we found that before we weren't getting a lot of feedback on study groups. People were coming to them, but we were really guessing week to week what topics we should cover, what we should be doing, what were the best times for things, and such. So we're really looking to collect some really solid feedback and improve our study groups week to week and continue iterating and just doing the best that we can possible. And that comes from you guys. So please take a minute if you have it and fill that out for us. It's super beneficial. It's anonymous, so don't worry about, be completely honest. And yeah, I'm going to be here for the next about a little more than 15 minutes. So go ahead and ask away any questions you got, any comments. But you don't have to stick around for my sake. If you want to get back to writing code, I completely understand. I was just like that not too long ago when I was in the program. Disheveled meta self a little more. So what is it used for? I'm honestly not 100% sure. It's not something that I've honestly ever done. I ran across it preparing for this lecture and thought it was pretty cool. It's useful here in that it could in essence, dry up the code a little bit. So if you wanted to make all these class level methods otherwise, they'd all would have to be self dot, self dot, self dot. So you can move that from them all and kind of set them off a little bit differently. But really it's showing in that, what was it, self dot, puts self dot. Dog. Let's see. So it's setting, it has the class here. So we have our class, and then since we're pushing onto that class something. So in our, when we had self, we're pushing the class onto it, because self right here is the class of dog. So that's where this comes from. Because this self is a class, and then we're inspecting it, and we pushed onto it itself. And that's one thing that Ruby allows, where we can actually overwrite code and change methods and such. It's not protective in that way, where we can do these types of things. It also makes it very powerful when you know how to use it correctly. Like I said, this is honestly something that I've never done, but I did run across it and thought it was kind of cool. That's kind of why I was debating whether I should show it or not, because I've never delved deep into singleton methods, which are what this is dealing with. Well, I guess, yeah, singleton methods are attached to the singleton class, which is the object's metaclass. The singleton methods are those attached to a particular object. And when a singleton method is executed, self is the object that owns the method. I'm not sure that's even making sense to me, but that is what's going on. Yeah, I see you trying to scrape the surface a little bit deeper, and yeah, I'm just as curious. I just didn't honestly have the time to dive deep into this meta stuff. It's still a little, even past me. I guess that's not saying too much. I'm not that far along. But yeah, thanks for the good questions. Anything else I can answer this evening? Good. Glad it could be a solid foundation as you move forward. And yeah, you're very welcome. Have a great night.